The galactic community has an unspoken rule about human ships. They don't write it down in the treaties. They don't teach it in their naval academies. But every pirate, scavenger, and rogue fleet commander knows it instinctively. It's whispered in the dark corners of the void, usually by those missing limbs or mandibles. The rule is brutally simple. You can overtax them. You can ignore them. But if you ambush them, pray you die in the initial volley. Because humanity doesn't negotiate. They burn. The air inside the Goliath always tasted faintly of copper and stale sweat. It was a flavor Arthur had grown so accustomed to over 12 years of deep space freighting that clean planetary air usually made him nauseous. He rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers coming away slick with grime. The command deck of the Goliath wasn't a deck so much as a closet stuffed with glowing panels, exposed wiring, and 3 chairs that had lost their lumbar support a decade ago. It hummed constantly, a deep, bone-rattling vibration from the massive fusion drive sitting 300 meters aft, pushing 30,000 tons of refined iridium through the black. Manifold pressure is dropping again, Riggs muttered. She was crammed under the primary console, half her body swallowed by a maintenance hatch. Her voice was muffled, accompanied by the harsh, metallic scraping of a spanner against a stripped bolt. I swear to God, Artie, if the company doesn't authorize a dry dock refit in New Denver, I'm taking a blowtorch to the CEO's car. Just patch it, Riggs, Arthur said. His voice was gravelly, worn thin by too much cheap coffee and too little sleep. We're 3 days out from the jump gate. Keep us from exploding until then, and the bonus is yours. In the pilot's seat, Cole snorted. Bonus? Right. They'll probably pay us in company scrip again. I've got 300 credits of Garrison Interstellar Value points burning a hole in my pocket, and the only place that accepts them is the vending machine in the break room. Arthur didn't smile. He just stared at the main optical display. The slipspace tunnel outside was a hypnotic, nauseating swirl of violet and bruised black. It was boring. Boredom was good. Boredom meant they were alive, and the cargo was safe, and the universe was leaving them the hell alone. Then, the ship screamed. It wasn't a metaphorical scream. The Goliath possessed an ancient, mechanical proximity alarm that sounded exactly like a rusted circular saw biting into a steel pipe. The deck dropped. There was no other way to describe it. 1 second they were in the smooth, frictionless slide of slipspace, and the next they hit a brick wall at a fraction of light speed. Arthur's chest slammed into the restraint harness. All the air left his lungs in a violent rush. His teeth snapped together, biting the inside of his cheek. The coppery taste in his mouth was suddenly hot and fresh. Blood. Under the console, Riggs let out a sharp, breathless string of curses, followed by the heavy thud of her skull hitting the decking. "Report!" Arthur choked out, fighting the black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. He fumbled for the console, his fingers numb and trembling. Cole was slumped over the yoke, groaning, a thin line of red tracking from his hairline down to his chin. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head to clear the concussion protocol. "Mass shadow," Cole wheezed. "Artificial. Someone dropped a tether in the lane. We've been yanked into real space." The opticals snapped back online, the swirling violet replaced by the cold, unforgiving black of the void. And there, hanging in the dark like a bloated, metallic tick, was a ship. It wasn't military. It was too ugly, too asymmetrical. Jagged hull plating, exposed weapon mounts, and an engine signature that burned a dirty, radioactive yellow. "Pirates," Arthur said. The word tasted worse than the blood. "Trakiri," Cole corrected, his hands flying across the rebooting panels. "Look at the thermal spines. It's a hunting pack. Scanners show they're already locking on. They're matching our drift. Arthur felt a cold, heavy stone settle in his gut. The Trakiri didn't take prisoners. They were scavengers, operating on the fringes of civilized space, viewing other species as either resources or obstacles. To them, a human freighter was a floating piñata of rare metals and spare parts. "Comms are dead. They're jamming us," Cole said, his voice tightening. The panic was starting to bleed in. He was young. He hadn't been out here long enough to realize that panic just meant you died tired. "Riggs," Arthur snapped, unbuckling his harness. "Status on the drive." Riggs pulled herself out from under the console. Her grease-stained face was pale. "Safety's kicked in. The core scrammed when we hit the mass shadow. It'll take me 20 minutes to manually reset the dampeners and spool it back up." "We don't have 20 minutes, Arthur said. A heavy, sickening thud reverberated through the hull. The deck plates groaned. It wasn't an explosion. It was mechanical. Physical. "Grappling lines," Cole whispered. "They've harpooned the airlock." Arthur looked at his two crewmates, a mechanic with a wrench and a pilot with a mild concussion. They had no security detail. The Goliath had no point defense cannons. They were a delivery truck in a dark alley. He wiped the blood from his chin with the back of his hand. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, primal rhythm. He felt the fear. It was icy and sharp, piercing right through the cynicism he wore like armor. But beneath the fear, something else was waking up. A hot, jagged knot of pure, unadulterated anger. "They think we're an easy meal," Arthur said quietly. He hit the ship-wide intercom. "All hands. This is the captain. We are being boarded. Repel boarders." He looked at Cole and Riggs. "Go to the engineering bay. Lock the blast doors." "What about you?" Riggs asked, her voice trembling. Arthur opened the emergency locker beneath his console. He pulled out a heavy, battery-operated rivet gun. It was meant for patching hull breaches. It weighed 20 pounds and drove 6-inch spikes of depleted uranium through solid steel. "I'm going to welcome them aboard." The corridor leading to the primary starboard airlock was narrow, lit only by the sickly red glow of the emergency lumen strips. The air here was colder. The life support systems were already rerouting power to the core, abandoning the peripheral sections of the ship. Arthur stood 20 feet down the corridor, pressed against the bulkhead, the heavy rivet gun resting on a storage crate in front of him. His hands were sweating, making the textured grip of the tool feel slick and unreliable. He tried to control his breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. It didn't help. His chest felt tight, a band of iron squeezing his lungs. He was terrified. He was a truck driver, not a soldier. He liked his quiet, boring life. He wanted his bad coffee and his creaky chair. From the airlock, a high-pitched, whining hiss began. The Trakiri were cutting their way in. The smell hit him first, the sharp, acrid stench of ozone mixed with the foul, sulphurous odor of melting tritanium. A bright, blindingly white spark showered from the center of the heavy airlock door. The metal began to blister, turning a cherry red, then a furious, incandescent white. They weren't hacking the door controls. They were just burning right through the locking mechanism. Arrogant. They didn't care about preserving the ship's integrity. They knew the Goliath couldn't fight back. Clang. A heavy magnetic boot struck the exterior hull. The sound resonated through the deck plating, vibrating right up through the soles of Arthur's boots. He thumbed the safety off the rivet gun. The battery pack whined softly, charging the pneumatic piston. Clang. Clang. More boots. They were stacking up in the umbilical tube, waiting for the breach. Arthur closed his eyes for a second. He remembered a bar on a frontier station years ago. A drunk, scarred mercenary had laughed at him for not carrying a sidearm on his hauls. "The void is full of teeth, freighter boy," the merc had sneered. "One day the dark's gonna bite." Arthur opened his eyes. The center of the airlock door turned to liquid slag and slumped to the floor, splashing molten metal across the grating. The air hissed violently as the pressure between the ship and the boarding tube briefly, violently equalized. A cloud of grey smoke and condensation billowed into the corridor. Then the door was violently kicked open. It groaned on ruined hinges and slammed against the wall. Through the smoke, a shape emerged. It was tall, hunched, and clad in heavily scarred, scavenged armor. A tracheri. It looked like a bipedal reptile that had been stretched out and starved, all sharp angles, elongated limbs, and a jaw full of jagged, interlocking teeth. It held a kinetic carbine swept low, its pale, slitted eyes scanning the corridor. It stepped over the threshold. It didn't look up, didn't check the corners. It moved with the casual, lazy confidence of a predator entering a pen full of docile livestock. It let out a low, clicking bark to the others waiting in the tube, turning its head slightly. Arthur didn't shout. He didn't offer a dramatic one-liner. He just pulled the trigger. The rivet gun bucked in his hands with a deafening thwack. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, bruising the bone instantly. A 6-inch spike of depleted uranium, designed to pierce starship armor, hit the tracheri square in the chest plate. The scavenged armor shattered like cheap glass. The spike punched cleanly through its sternum, lifting the alien off its feet and pinning it violently against the bulkhead behind it with a sickening crunch. The creature didn't scream. It just convulsed once, its kinetic rifle clattering to the deck, and went limp, thick, dark, purple blood bubbling from the hole in its chest. Silence slammed back down on the corridor, ringing in Arthur's ears. He stared at the dead thing pinned to the wall. He had just killed a living creature. His stomach violently rolled. He tasted bile at the back of his throat and swallowed it down hard. He couldn't afford to throw up. Not yet. From the boarding tube, a series of frantic, enraged clicks and hisses erupted. The casual confidence was gone. "One down," Arthur whispered to himself, his voice shaking. He racked the heavy charging handle of the rivet gun. Clack, clack. 2 more tracheri surged through the breach, moving faster now, weapons raised. They were screaming, a terrifying, high-pitched screech that scraped against Arthur's eardrums. Arthur fired again. Missed. The uranium spike buried itself in the decking, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The closest alien fired its carbine. The kinetic slug tore through the air, ripping a chunk out of the storage crate Arthur was using for cover. Splinters of hardened plastic slashed across Arthur's cheek. It stung like a swarm of angry hornets. Arthur ducked low, adrenaline flooding his system, entirely erasing the fear and replacing it with a cold, desperate need to survive. He swung the heavy tool around the side of the crate and fired blind. A screech of agony told him he connected. He peeked over the edge. One alien was on its knees, clutching a ruined leg, dark blood pooling rapidly. The other was charging right at him, its jaws unhinged, revealing rows of serrated teeth, a short, electrified blade drawn from its belt. Arthur tried to fire, but the rivet gun jammed. A red light blinked on the battery housing. Empty. The tracheri lunged, bringing the crackling blade down. Arthur didn't think. He reacted with the messy, uncoordinated violence of a cornered animal. He threw the heavy, 20-pound rivet gun directly into the creature's face. The heavy tool smashed into the alien's snout with a wet crunch of breaking cartilage. The creature stumbled back, shrieking, dropping the blade. Arthur scrambled over the crate, grabbed the discarded kinetic carbine from the floor, fumbled with the unfamiliar grip, and pulled the trigger. A burst of solid slugs tore through the alien's midsection, dropping it instantly. Arthur stood there, chest heaving, the unfamiliar alien weapon shaking violently in his hands. 3 dead bodies. The smell of blood, thick, sweet, and alien, mixed with the ozone. His earpiece crackled. "Artie? Artie, you there?" Riggs's voice was frantic. "Scanners show they're breaching the cargo bays. We got multiple boarding parties, Captain. There's too many of them." Arthur wiped the blood from his cheek. He looked down at the dead alien at his feet. The galaxy thought humans were soft. Soft because they liked peace. Soft because they built freighters instead of warships. They forgot that to a human, anything is a weapon if you swing it hard enough. "Riggs," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, the tremor gone, replaced by a hollow, terrifying calm. "Vent the atmosphere in cargo bays 3 through 6. Blow the external hatches. Captain, that'll dump half our payload into space." "Do it. And Riggs?" "Yeah?" "Patch me into the ship's PA system. Overload the volume limiters. Let's make some noise." The Goliath shuddered violently. A low, thunderous boom echoed through the deck plating, felt more than heard as the emergency blowout panels on cargo bays 3 through 6 detonated. Deep inside the bowels of the ship, 20 Trakiri raiders had been systematically cutting their way through the secondary bulkheads, expecting no resistance. They were hunters in a field of prey. They didn't check the atmospheric regulators. They didn't monitor the pressure gauges. When Riggs blew the hatches, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. In a fraction of a second, the atmosphere inside the massive bays violently evacuated into the hard vacuum of space. The sudden decompression acted like a giant, invisible hand. Massive crates of iridium ore, heavy machinery, and 20 heavily armed alien pirates were sucked out into the void in a silent, violent tornado of debris. Arthur felt the gravity plating struggle to compensate for the sudden loss of mass. He leaned against the corridor wall, the captured alien carbine resting on his hip. He was breathing heavily, sweat stinging his eyes, mixing with the blood on his cheek. The ship was groaning. The structural integrity field was whining in protest. He was tearing his own ship apart to kill the infection. His comms crackled. "Atmosphere vented, Captain. Bays are sealed. We lost a lot of cargo." Riggs sounded terrified, but there was a sharp edge of adrenaline in her voice now. "Doesn't matter," Arthur replied. He started moving down the corridor, heading aft toward engineering. "If they take the ship, we lose it all anyway. Cole, how many left on the scanners?" "It's a mess down here, Arthur." Cole's voice was tight. "Sensors are glitching from the decompression, but I'm tracking at least a dozen heat signatures moving through the lower maintenance decks. They're heading for the reactor. They want to shut down our power." If they got to the reactor room, they would kill Riggs and Cole, lock down the ship's systems, and Arthur would be hunted in the dark. "Not going to happen," Arthur muttered. He moved through the ship like a ghost haunting his own house. He knew every loose deck plate, every flickering light, every blind spot on the internal cameras. He knew the Goliath better than he knew his own reflection. He slipped into a primary ventilation shaft, crawling on his elbows and knees. The metal was freezing cold, smelling of ancient dust and chemical filters. He could hear them below him, heavy boots clanking on the metal grating. Sharp, angry clicks and hisses. They were disorganized now. The blowout had spooked them. The easy prey had just bitten off the hunter's arm. Arthur reached a grate overlooking the main artery leading to engineering. He peered through the slots. 5 Trakiri were moving down the hall. They were walking backward, covering all angles, weapons raised. They were nervous. Good. Arthur didn't have a tactical plan. He didn't have flashbangs or combat training, but he was a deep space mechanic before he was a captain, and he knew what ran through the pipes lining these walls. Directly above the alien squad was a thick, yellow-painted conduit. It carried supercooled liquid freon for the secondary life support systems. Arthur raised the kinetic carbine. He didn't aim at the aliens. He aimed at the pipe. He held his breath and squeezed the trigger. The carbine barked. 3 solid slugs ripped through the thin metal of the conduit. The pipe didn't just leak, it ruptured. A high-pressure geyser of liquid freon, chilled to negative 200 degrees Celsius, exploded downward into the narrow corridor. The reaction was immediate and horrific. The liquid freon hit the trachea, instantly vaporizing into a dense, freezing white fog. The aliens shrieked, a sound of pure agony that tore at Arthur's conscience, but he forced himself to watch. The supercooled liquid flash froze their scales, their armor, their eyes. 2 of them dropped instantly, their nervous systems sent into immediate, catastrophic shock. The other 3 thrashed blindly in the freezing fog, their weapons firing wildly into the bulkheads. Arthur didn't wait. He kicked the vent grate out, dropping down into the corridor behind the freezing cloud. He came up behind the nearest thrashing alien and swung the butt of the heavy carbine like a baseball bat, catching the creature behind the knees. It went down. He stepped over it, moving purely on instinct and terror. He wasn't a hero. His hands were shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the rifle. He felt sick. He felt violated. These creatures had come into his home, threatened his crew, and forced him to become a butcher. He hated them for it. "Riggs!" Arthur yelled into his comms, stepping out of the freezing fog, leaving the incapacitated aliens groaning on the deck. "I'm outside the primary engineering bulkhead. Open the door!" The heavy steel doors slid apart. Arthur lunged through, the doors slamming shut and locking the second he was clear. He collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor. The carbine clattered to the deck. He pulled his knees to his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline was starting to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. Riggs and Cole stared at him. He looked like a nightmare. Covered in grease, alien blood, and freezing condensation, his face bruised and bleeding. "Artie," Riggs whispered, holding a heavy monkey wrench like a club. "You okay?" "No," Arthur choked out, closing his eyes. "No, I'm not." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "But we're alive." "For now," Cole said, his hands flying across the terminal. "The pirate ship. It's moving. They're detaching the umbilical. They're pulling back." Arthur opened his eyes. "Pulling back? Why?" "Because you just slaughtered half their boarding party with mining tools and climate control systems," Riggs said, a nervous, hysterical laugh escaping her. "No," Cole said, his voice dropping. "They're pulling back to a safe distance. They're spinning up their main battery. If they can't take the ship, they're going to crack it open." Arthur looked at the main monitor. The ugly, jagged alien ship was drifting away, its forward plasma cannons glowing a furious, blinding orange. They were going to slag the Goliath. Arthur stared at the glowing cannons. The fear was gone now. The sickness was gone. All that was left was the fire. He pushed himself off the floor. His back popped. He tasted the copper blood in his mouth and spat it onto the deck. He walked over to the primary engineering console, pushing Cole gently aside. "Captain," Cole asked. Arthur looked at Riggs. "You said the safeties kicked in when we hit the mass shadow. The core scrammed." "Yeah, it's locked down to prevent a critical overload." "Disable the safeties," Arthur said. Riggs stared at him, her eyes wide. "Arthur, if I disable the safeties, the core will run hot. If we try to vent the plasma without the regulators, it won't just purge. It'll act like a directed flare. It'll melt the entire aft section of the ship." "Disable them, Riggs," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Reroute the plasma purge vents to the forward navigational deflectors." Cole gasped. You're turning the main reactor into a blowtorch." "They wanted to see how humans fight," Arthur said, his fingers flying across the console, locking in the targeting coordinates of the pirate ship. He hit the intercom button, broadcasting his voice on all open frequencies, straight into the teeth of the enemy ship. "This is Captain Arthur Hayes of the human freighter Goliath," he said, his voice echoing in the small, cramped room. "You broke into my house. You threatened my crew." He slammed his hand down on the manual override. "Get off my lawn." The Goliath was not designed to be a weapon. She was a beast of burden, built with the architectural grace of a cinder block and the subtle engineering of a sledgehammer. Her fusion reactor was shielded by 6 feet of lead and high-density polyalloy, meant to contain the miniature sun burning at her heart. Arthur's command stripped all of that away. The console beneath his bruised hands lit up like a Christmas tree wired to a high-voltage main line. Warning klaxons, previously blaring in rhythmic pulses, merged into one continuous, high-pitched shriek. "Dampeners are offline," Riggs yelled, her hands flying over her terminal, desperately trying to route auxiliary power to the structural integrity fields. "Core temperature spiking. We are deep in the red, Artie. The containment field is buckling. Hold it together, Riggs," Arthur shouted back, his eyes locked on the primary optical feed. The Trakiri hunter-killer was a mile off their port bow. Its forward mandibles glowed with the sickening, irradiated orange of superheated plasma. They were taking their time. They had the human freighter dead to rights. They were aiming for the engines, intending to cripple the Goliath permanently before sweeping in to pick over the bones. "Cole, give me a 10-second countdown," Arthur ordered. He grabbed a heavy metal handle under the primary console, the manual release for the magnetic purge valves. It was a failsafe, a physical lever designed for catastrophic emergencies when the computers died. 10! Cole's voice was an octave higher than normal. He was gripping his armrest so hard his knuckles were white. The deck plates beneath their boots began to heat up. It wasn't a gradual warming. It was sudden and fierce. The ambient temperature in the engineering bay skyrocketed. The sharp, toxic smell of melting insulation and scorching rubber filled the cramped room. 9, 8. Arthur felt the sweat instantly bead on his forehead and run into his eyes, stinging the cuts on his cheek. He blinked it away. The metal handle in his grip was growing uncomfortably warm. 7, 6. Outside, the Trakiri ship's plasma cannons reached peak luminosity. A blinding flash of orange light erupted from their muzzles. 2 massive, cohesive bolts of stellar fury tore through the vacuum, screaming straight for the Goliath. 5, 4, brace! Arthur roared, throwing his entire body weight backward, hauling the manual release lever with a guttural scream. The lever locked into the open position with a brutal mechanical clank. What happened next defied the neat, organized physics of space combat. The Goliath didn't fire a laser. It didn't launch a missile. It vomited a star. The primary purge vents, normally used to safely trickle excess heat into the void over a period of hours, were forced open at maximum aperture in a millisecond. A massive, unregulated torrent of raw, uncontained fusion plasma exploded outward, funneled through the forward navigational deflectors. It was a messy, chaotic, blinding gout of pure white destruction. It looked less like a weapon and more like a catastrophic industrial accident. The Trakiri plasma bolts hit the Goliath's port side just as the massive flare erupted. The ship violently lurched. Arthur was thrown entirely out of his chair, slamming hard into the starboard bulkhead. His shoulder popped, a sickening sound completely masked by the sheer, deafening roar vibrating through the hull. The Goliath was screaming. The metal was tearing itself apart. Out in the void, The human ship's improvised blowtorch intercepted the Trakiri vessel. The pirate ship had no deflector shields designed to withstand point-blank stellar immersion. The raw plasma washed over the ugly, jagged hull. The heavy titanium armor didn't shatter, it simply vaporized. The kinetic impact of the explosive purge slammed into the pirate ship like a solid wall, tossing the heavily armored predator backward, end over end. For 3 terrifying seconds, the Goliath bathed the void in a blinding white sunburst. Then, the emergency breakers shattered. The reactor violently shut itself down, choking on its own fuel to prevent a total breach. The blinding light vanished, instantly replaced by the oppressive, absolute black of space. Inside the engineering bay, the screaming klaxons died. The low, comforting hum of the fusion drive faded into nothing. The primary lights flickered, popped, and went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Then, the absolute silence rushed in. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. The Goliath was dead. Arthur lay on the grating, his face pressed against the warm metal. Everything hurt. His shoulder was a throbbing, radiant knot of agony. His lungs burned with the smell of scorched ozone and burnt plastic. He didn't want to move. He just wanted to lie there in the dark and let the quiet take him. He had done it. He had fought back. He had emptied the magazine, thrown the gun, and flipped the table. Now, he was just tired. A sharp, rhythmic click hiss cut through the silence. Emergency life support batteries kicking in. A moment later, the sickly red glow of the auxiliary lumen strips flickered to life, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined engineering bay. "Cole?" Arthur croaked. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Riggs?" A groan came from under the primary terminal. Riggs crawled out. Her overalls were covered in white chemical foam from an exploded fire extinguisher. She was coughing violently, hacking up black soot. "I'm here," she wheezed, sitting up and leaning against the server rack. "I think my ribs are cracked." Arthur pushed himself up onto his knees, favoring his bad shoulder. He looked toward the pilot station. Cole was slumped forward, suspended by his crash harness. Arthur's heart stopped. He scrambled over, ignoring the pain, and grabbed Cole's shoulder. Cole gasped, his eyes snapping open. He thrashed for a second, disoriented, before focusing on Arthur. "Captain, I blacked out." Arthur let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He patted Cole's cheek, his hand leaving a smear of dirt and blood. "You're okay, kid. You're okay." Arthur pulled himself up, using the edge of the console. The primary screens were shattered or dead. Only a few secondary tactical readouts were functioning on battery power. He keyed the optical feed. The camera lenses were severely scorched, the image distorted and grainy. The Trakiri ship was floating 2 miles away. It was a ruin. The entire forward section of the vessel was melted slag, glowing a dull, angry red in the vacuum. Debris was venting from massive, ragged holes in its hull. There were no lights, no engine signatures. It was a floating tomb. Arthur stared at it. He felt no triumph, no swell of heroic victory, just a cold, nauseating knot in his stomach. How many living things were on that ship? How many had he just incinerated in a fraction of a second? "They would have done it to you," a small, cynical voice whispered in his head. "They would have cut you up for spare parts." "We got them?" Cole whispered, staring at the monitor. "Jesus, Artie, we actually got them." "We didn't get anyone," Riggs said, her voice grim. She was tapping away at a diagnostic pad. "We just punched a hole in a wall by breaking our own hand." Arthur turned to her. "Damage report." Riggs didn't look up. Her face was illuminated by the harsh white light of the datapad. "It's bad, Captain." The plasma purge melted the entire forward sensor array and half the deflector dish. The Trakiri shots hit our port side. Cargo bays 1 and 2 are gone, exposed to the vacuum. The reactor? Arthur asked. Scrammed completely. The containment vessel is intact barely, but the primary jump capacitor is fused into a solid lump of titanium. We channeled too much power through an unregulated line. The breaker melted. Arthur closed his eyes. The jump capacitor was the heart of the slipspace drive. Without it, they couldn't enter hyperspace. Can you fix it? Arthur asked. With what? Riggs snapped, the panic finally bubbling to the surface. We're a freighter, not a dry dock. I don't have a spare Class 4 capacitor sitting in my toolbox. We are dead in the water, Arthur. Real space propulsion is dead. Slipspace is dead. Comms? Cole asked. Fried by the EMP from the plasma burst, Riggs said, throwing the datapad onto the deck in frustration. And life support is running on auxiliary batteries. We have maybe 20 hours of heat and scrubbed air before this ship turns into a meat locker. The adrenaline was entirely gone now. The reality of their situation settled over the engineering bay like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The temperature was already dropping. Arthur could see his breath faintly pluming in the red emergency light. They had survived the ambush, but the void was patient. It would just freeze them instead of shooting them. Arthur looked back at the monitor, at the dead, drifting hulk of the Trakiri ship. Riggs, Arthur said slowly, his voice terribly quiet. The Trakiri use scavenged tech, right? They bolt together whatever they can steal. Riggs frowned, clutching her ribs. Yeah, it's a miracle their ships don't tear themselves apart. Do they use human tech? Riggs paused. She looked at the monitor, then at Arthur. Her eyes widened. Captain, no way. Do they? Arthur pressed. Yes, Riggs said, her voice shaking. They raid human shipping lanes. They probably have dozens of retrofitted standard parts in their engine blocks. But Arthur, look at that ship. It's heavily irradiated. The structural integrity is 0, and it's full of dead pirates. 20 hours, Arthur said. He walked over to the environmental locker and punched in the access code. The heavy metal doors slid open, revealing 3 bulky orange EVA suits. Cole, you stay here. Route all remaining battery power to the air scrubbers and internal comms. Keep a beacon on standby just in case you can get the antenna patched. Arthur pulled a heavy helmet from the locker. It smelled faintly of ammonia and old sweat. He looked at his mechanic. Suit up, Riggs. We're going over there. The silence of a spacewalk was never truly silent. It was deeply, uncomfortably loud. Inside the heavy EVA suit, Arthur could hear every biological process of his own body. The ragged, uneven wheeze of his breathing, the frantic, erratic thumping of his heart against his bruised ribs, the dry click of his swallow. It was a claustrophobic symphony of his own mortality. He floated through the void, tethered to the Goliath by a thin, woven carbon line. 50 yards ahead of him was the gaping, melted wound of the Trakiri ship. The void was terrifyingly cold, a kind of cold that seemed to seep right through the insulated layers of the suit and settle directly into the marrow of his bones. He gripped his handheld maneuvering thruster tightly, his thick gloves making his hands feel clumsy and useless. Beside him, Riggs drifted silently, a bulky orange shape against the infinite black. Approaching the breach, Arthur muttered into his suit comms. The radio cracked and hissed with static. The ambient radiation from the plasma burn was playing hell with the signal. Copy that, Captain, Cole's voice came back, distant and thin. Radiation levels are high, but your suits can handle it for about 2 hours before you start cooking. Structural scans are a mess. Watch your step. Half that ship is holding together by friction and bad intentions. Understood. Arthur angled his thruster and fired a short burst of compressed nitrogen. He drifted slowly into the jagged maw of the pirate vessel. There was no airlock left. The Goliath's plasma flare had sheared away the exterior bulkheads like a blowtorch through wax. Arthur floated past melted beams that looked like twisted ribs jutting from a rotting carcass. He hit his helmet-mounted flashlights. 2 beams of harsh, bright light cut through the gloom. The interior of the Trakiri ship was a nightmare. Whatever gravity plating they possessed had failed. Debris hung suspended in the dead air. Scorched metal, frozen droplets of coolant, and things Arthur desperately tried not to look too closely at. "Magnetize boots," Arthur ordered. He drifted toward what looked like a solid deck plate and engaged his boots. They hit the metal with a heavy, reverberating thump. The sound conducted through his suit, a jarring reminder of physical reality in a weightless tomb. Riggs landed heavily next to him. "We need to find their engineering bay," Arthur said, panning his flashlight down the ruined corridor. "If they have a Class 4 capacitor, it'll be wired into their main drive array. Assuming you didn't vaporize it," Riggs muttered, her voice trembling over the radio. They walked slowly, their heavy boots clanking magnetically against the deck. The ship was a labyrinth of scavenged technology, human wiring grafted onto alien power conduits. Bulkheads welded together with sloppy, jagged seams. It smelled of burnt copper and frozen meat. The suit filters couldn't catch everything. They turned a corner and Arthur stopped dead. 3 Trakiri were suspended in the corridor. They hadn't been burned by the plasma. They had suffocated when the hull breached, flash-frozen in the sudden vacuum. They floated in grotesque, contorted poses, their long limbs tangled, their jaws wide open in silent screams. Arthur felt the bile rise in his throat. He forced himself to look away, aiming his flashlight at the deck. "I did this," the thought echoed in the claustrophobic confines of his helmet. I pulled the lever. He was a man who hauled iridium for a living. He liked reading cheap mystery novels in the mess hall. He liked making bad coffee. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a killer. But out here, the line between victim and monster was just a matter of who pulled the trigger first. "Keep moving," Arthur choked out, stepping carefully around the frozen bodies. They navigated deeper into the guts of the ship. The structural damage was terrifying. Whole sections of the vessel were crushed inward. In some places, they had to unmagnetize their boots and pull themselves through narrow, jagged gaps in the twisted metal. Finally, they reached a heavy, reinforced door that had buckled off its hinges. "This is it," Riggs said, shining her light inside. "Engineering." Arthur stepped through the frame. The room was massive, dominated by a towering, ugly engine block that looked like a tumor made of steel and wire. And huddled against the base of the reactor, something moved. Arthur instinctively reached for his hip, but he had left the alien carbine back on the Goliath. He was unarmed. He swept his flashlight over. It was a Trakiri. It was wearing a heavy, pressurized environmental suit, similar to theirs but patched with duct tape and scavenged armor plating. The creature was sitting on the floor, its back against the reactor housing. It raised a trembling, elongated hand to block the harsh light. Arthur froze. His heart hammered violently against his sternum. A survivor. The alien didn't reach for a weapon. It just looked at them through the scratched, cracked visor of its helmet. Its chest heaved with slow, ragged breaths. It was dying. A massive piece of shrapnel was buried deep in its side, dark fluids freezing around the wound. Arthur stood there, his fists clenched inside his heavy gloves. This was the enemy. This creature was part of the crew that had tried to board his ship, slaughter his friends, and steal his livelihood. The hatred flared up again, hot and sharp. He could just walk away, leave it to die in the cold. It was what they deserved. The alien let out a low, clicking sound over the open radio frequency. It wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't a threat. It sounded weak, pitiful. Arthur took a step forward. Riggs grabbed his arm. "Artie, don't," she whispered over the private channel. "It could have a detonator. A sidearm." "Leave it." Arthur gently pulled his arm away. He walked over to the dying creature. The Trakiri shrank back slightly, its slitted, pale eyes fixed on the human. It expected violence. It expected the human to finish the job. Arthur knelt clumsily in his heavy suit. He looked at the creature. He looked at the ugly, brutal ship they had built. A life spent hurting others, ending in a freezing, dark room millions of miles from anywhere. Arthur reached down to his tool belt. He unclipped a small, heavy emergency medical kit. It wasn't designed for alien physiology, but it had coagulants and a heavy dose of universal painkillers. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was just a desperate need to prove that he hadn't lost his soul when he pulled that lever. He placed the medical kit on the deck, pushing it slowly toward the alien. The Trakiri stared at the white box with the red cross. Then it looked up at Arthur. The absolute, primal fear in its eyes shifted, replaced by something else. Confusion. Shock. Arthur stood up, backing away slowly. "Riggs," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite name. "Find the capacitor! Cut it out! We're going home!" Riggs didn't look at the alien. She kept her helmet light fixed strictly on the towering, rusted mass of the Trakiri engine block. She moved with the frantic, jerky efficiency of a mechanic working on a ticking bomb. Arthur stood awkwardly nearby, his shoulder a knot of radiating fire, holding the primary work light steady. The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the abrasive sound of their own ragged breathing over the comms and the occasional, violent scrape of metal on metal as Riggs tore into the pirate ship's guts. "They're butchers," Riggs muttered, her voice distorted by the static. "Look at this wiring harness. It's spliced with bare copper and wrapped in thermal tape. One power surge and this whole deck would have turned into a microwave oven." "Just find the capacitor, Riggs," Arthur said. His jaw ached. He realized he was clenching his teeth so hard, his gums were throbbing. "I'm trying," she grunted, bracing her heavy boots against the deck and pulling hard on a massive panel. It groaned, warped by the heat of the plasma wash, and finally snapped free, floating away into the dark. Behind the panel, nestled in a chaotic web of mismatched cables and cooling tubes, was a dull grey cylinder the size of a beer keg. It was stamped with faded, recognizable lettering. Garrison Interstellar. Model 4. "Got it," Riggs breathed, her shoulders dropping in a momentary wave of relief. "Class 4. It's an older model, probably stripped from a salvage barge, but it's intact. The housing isn't breached." She reached in with a heavy plasma cutter, her gloved hands clumsy in the thick EVA suit. The blue flame hissed silently in the vacuum, slicing through the thick mounting brackets. Arthur shifted his weight, his eyes involuntarily drifting back to the Trakiri survivor. The alien was still slumped against the reactor housing. It had managed to open the human medkit. Its long, trembling, three-fingered hands were clumsily applying a thick layer of synthetic coagulant foam over the shrapnel wound in its side. It wasn't fixing the internal damage, but it was stopping the bleeding. The creature paused, its pale, slitted eyes meeting Arthur's through the scratched visor of its helmet. Arthur didn't look away. He felt a strange, hollow exhaustion looking at it. 2 hours ago, this creature would have gutted him for the spare change in his pocket. Now, they were just two dying things trapped in a metal box millions of miles from the sun. The grand, terrifying clash between humanity and the hostile galaxy had boiled down to a quiet, pathetic stare-down in a freezing room. "Damn it!" Riggs hissed, breaking the silence. Arthur snapped his attention back to the engine block. What? The lower bracket is warped, Riggs said, her voice rising in panic. The heat from our plasma purge melted the secondary structural strut. It collapsed onto the capacitor's housing. I can't cut it without breaching the vacuum seal on the part. If I breach the seal, the capacitor is dead. Can we pry it? Arthur asked, moving closer. Not with these tools. We need a hydraulic jack, or a winch. The strut weighs half a ton. Arthur wedged his gloved hands under the melted strut. He locked his knees, took a deep breath, and heaved upward. Pain exploded in his bad shoulder, a white-hot spike that made his vision blur. He groaned, falling back against the bulkhead, his chest heaving. The strut hadn't moved a millimeter. "Captain," Riggs said, reaching for him. "I'm fine," Arthur choked out, clutching his arm. "I'm fine. We just need leverage." A heavy metallic thud echoed through the deck plating. Arthur and Riggs turned. The Drakiri was standing. It was hunched over, leaning heavily against the reactor housing, one hand clutching its foam-sealed side. It was staring at the trapped capacitor. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Arthur barked, his voice sharp, instinctively dropping his hand to the heavy wrench on his belt. The alien didn't attack. It didn't reach for a weapon. Slowly, agonizingly, it dragged itself along the wall, leaving a smear of dark fluid on the metal. It reached the side of the engine block, opposite where Riggs was working. The creature reached out a trembling hand and felt along a thick, grease-covered pipe. Its fingers found a recessed, heavily concealed manual valve. It looked at Arthur. Then it pulled the valve hard. Deep inside the engine block, something hissed. A loud mechanical clank reverberated through the frame. The heavy, melted strut that had pinned the capacitor suddenly shifted, a massive pneumatic piston disengaging beneath it. The strut sagged backward, releasing its pressure on the grey cylinder. Riggs gasped. She reached in and pulled. The heavy Class 4 capacitor slid free from its housing, floating gently into her arms. Arthur stared at the alien. The creature released the valve and slumped back onto the floor, its energy entirely spent. It didn't look at them for gratitude. It just closed its pale eyes, its head resting against the cold iron of the reactor. It was a transaction. A life for a part. The dark void had its own brutal economy, and the debt was paid. "Secure the part," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "We're leaving." The journey back across the void was agonizing. 150 pounds of dead weight didn't magically become easier to handle just because it was weightless. The capacitor was bulky, unbalanced, and hard to grip in the thick EVA gloves. Arthur and Riggs took turns hauling it along the thin carbon tether, kicking their thrusters in short, conservative bursts. The blackness between the two ships felt infinitely deeper than before. Arthur's shoulder was a dull, constant throb that radiated down to his fingertips. He felt sick to his stomach, a combination of zero-gravity nausea, radiation exposure, and sheer adrenaline crash. "Cole," Arthur rasped into the comms. "We have the package. Approaching the airlock. Status." Static hissed back. Then a voice, faint and shivering. "Hurry, Cap. It's getting bad in here. The ambient temp is down to -12 Celsius. Auxiliary batteries are failing. The air scrubbers are choking." "Hold on, kid," Arthur said, gritting his teeth. 2 minutes." They hit the exterior hull of the Goliath with a heavy, jarring impact. Arthur's boots magnetized, anchoring him to the cold iron of his own ship. The Goliath looked dead. No running lights, no engine glow. Just a jagged, bruised chunk of metal drifting in the abyss. They dragged the heavy capacitor into the airlock, sealed the exterior hatch, and hit the manual pressurization cycle. It took entirely too long. The emergency pumps wheezed, forcing recycled, freezing air into the small chamber. When the interior door finally slid open, a wave of biting cold hit them. It was colder inside the ship than it had been in the vacuum. The life support was barely clinging to life. They unsealed their helmets. Arthur took a breath and instantly coughed. The air tasted stale, heavy with carbon dioxide and the lingering metallic stench of burnt wiring. Every exhale plumed in front of his face like thick, white smoke. "Let's move!" Riggs shivered, her teeth chattering loudly. She grabbed one end of the capacitor. They hauled the massive cylinder down the pitch-black corridor. The emergency lumen strips had finally died. The only light came from the weak, failing beams on their suits. The ship was a ghost, a frozen tomb waiting to claim them. They reached the engineering bay. Cole was wrapped in 2 heavy thermal blankets, huddled in the pilot's chair. His lips were a distinct shade of blue. He wasn't shaking anymore, which terrified Arthur more than anything else. "Cole," Arthur said, dropping his end of the capacitor and rushing over to the kid. He slapped Cole's cheek. It was like slapping cold marble. "Hey, look at me. Don't go to sleep." Cole's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy. "I'm so cold, Artie." I know, Arthur said, his own hands numb inside his gloves. "Riggs is fixing the heater right now. Just talk to me. Tell me what you're going to buy with those company scrip points." Cole managed a weak, pathetic smile. "Stale pretzels. Exactly. The ones that taste like cardboard. You got to stay awake to eat 'em." Arthur looked over his shoulder. "Riggs, how long?" Riggs was already underneath the primary console, wedged into the frozen maintenance hatch. She was fighting with the heavy power cables, her breath clouding the narrow space. "It's not a clean fit. The Trakiri sheared the connectors when they scavenged it. I'm having to hardwire the primary leads directly into our bus board." "Will it hold?" "It's going to arc like a bastard, but it should bridge the gap to the main drive," Riggs yelled back, her voice thick with panic and cold. "Give me 3 minutes." Arthur knelt next to Cole, rubbing the kid's arms through the heavy blankets, trying to generate any kind of friction. The silence in the bay was oppressive. Without the hum of the reactor, the Goliath felt hollow. Unnatural. Arthur closed his eyes for a second. The exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on his skull. He wanted to lie down on the freezing deck grating. He wanted to stop fighting. "The void is full of teeth," the old mercenary's voice echoed in his memory. Arthur opened his eyes. The fear was gone. The anger was gone. All that remained was a cold, stubborn refusal to die in the dark. "I need light," Riggs shouted from beneath the console. "The suit beams are dying." Arthur grabbed his heavy flashlight, clicking it on and angling it into the hatch. Riggs was using heavy insulated pliers to strip the shielding off a massive, thumb-thick power cable. Her hands were shaking violently. "Hold it steady," she snapped. She grabbed the raw, exposed copper wire and forced it into the primary terminal of the scavenged capacitor. A brilliant, blinding shower of blue sparks erupted, illuminating the freezing engineering bay in harsh, strobe-like flashes. Riggs cried out as a stray spark hit her cheek, but she didn't let go. She grabbed a heavy roll of industrial bonding tape and wrapped it frantically around the raw connection, binding it to the terminal. "Okay!" Riggs scrambled backward out of the hatch, gasping for air. "Okay, it's wired. The circuit is closed." Arthur stood up, his joints popping in protest. He looked at the primary engineering terminal. The screen was black. "Moment of truth," Arthur whispered. He reached out and grabbed the heavy manual breaker switch on the wall. He didn't hesitate. He pulled it down. For 2 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The ship remained dead, cold, and silent. Arthur felt a crushing, bottomless despair open up in his chest. They were too late. The core was too cold. Then a deep, rhythmic thump vibrated up through the deck plates. Thump! Thump! It sounded like a massive, mechanical heartbeat. The emergency lumen strips flickered, buzzed aggressively, and suddenly flared to life, casting their warm, yellowish glow across the frost-covered room. The primary console beeped once, a sharp, piercing sound, before the screens flooded with streams of green diagnostic data, and then the sound they had all been praying for. The low, bone-rattling hum of the primary fusion drive spooling up. It started as a low vibration and built into a steady, powerful roar. Warm air blasted from the overhead ventilation grates, smelling of burnt dust and sweet, glorious oxygen. Cole let out a ragged, sobbing gasp, burying his face in his freezing hands. Riggs slumped against the server rack, sliding down to the floor, laughing and crying at the same time. "We have power," she wept. "Core temperature is rising. Dampeners are online. Structural fields are at 40%. Arthur stood perfectly still. He let the warm air hit his bruised, blood-stained face. He breathed it in deeply, tasting the metallic tang of the ship. It tasted like home. "Spool the slipspace drive," Arthur commanded, his voice hoarse but steady. "Get us out of here." The transition to slipspace was not the smooth, frictionless slide it usually was. The Goliath was critically wounded. When Cole punched the coordinates and engaged the drive, the massive freighter shuddered violently, screaming in metallic agony. For a terrifying moment, the ship seemed to stretch, the physical reality of the hull fighting against the dimensional tear. Then, the stars outside the forward opticals stretched into long, blinding streaks of violet and bruised black, and the ship snapped into the tunnel. They had made it. Arthur collapsed into the captain's chair. He didn't strap in. He just let his head fall back against the worn, uncomfortable padding. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been beaten with a lead pipe. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. "ETA to the New Denver jump gate is 30 hours, Cole reported, his voice weak but gaining strength as the cabin temperature steadily climbed. "I've broadcasted an automated distress signal on the company channels. By the time we drop out of slipspace, we should have a tug waiting for us." "Good," Arthur whispered. "Good work, Cole." "Captain?" Riggs asked softly. She was sitting on the floor, leaning against his chair. "Yeah, Riggs. That alien. The one on the pirate ship. Why didn't you just leave it to bleed out?" Arthur stared at the swirling violet tunnel on the main screen. He thought about the freezing, dark room. He thought about the pure, primal terror in the creature's eyes when it realized a human was standing over it. "Because that's what they expected," Arthur said quietly. "They expected us to be soft until we fought back. Then they expected us to be monsters. I wanted them to know we can be both, and neither." He rubbed his eyes, his fingers coming away stained with dried blood and grease. "They ambushed a civilian freighter," Arthur continued, his voice hardening, losing the exhaustion and finding that cold, sharp edge again. "They expected a piñata. Instead, half their boarding party got flash-frozen, their ship got melted into slag by a reactor flare, and the survivors had to watch a human walk onto their ruined deck, steal their engine parts, and drop a bandage on their lap before leaving them to drift." Arthur looked at Riggs, a grim, humorless shadow passing over his bruised face. "We didn't just survive, Riggs. We left a witness." Out in the void, miles behind them, the ruined husk of the Trakiri ship drifted in the dark. It was dead in the water, heavily irradiated and filled with frozen bodies. But inside the dark engineering bay, a single creature sat breathing shallowly, clutching a human medical kit. It would take days for another pirate scavenger pack to find them. When they did, they would board the melted wreck, expecting to find the aftermath of a military strike. They would find the survivor, and the survivor would tell them the truth. There was no warship. There was no military escort. It was just a rusty, lumbering, human freighter hauling rocks. The story would spread. It wouldn't be broadcast on official diplomatic channels. It would travel the way real truth always travels in the dark corners of the galaxy, whispered in dockyard cantinas, muttered over smuggled cargo, traded in shadows. The galaxy had spent a long time looking down on humanity. They saw a species obsessed with trade, with farming, with building comfortable, boring lives. They saw softness. They didn't understand that humanity's preference for peace wasn't a lack of capability. It was a choice they made every single day to keep the monster in the basement locked away. But when you corner a human, when you break into their home and threaten their people, they don't just fight back. They rip the lock off the basement door. They turn their tools into weapons. They turn their engines into blowtorches. They tear their own ship apart just to make sure you burn with it. Arthur Hayes leaned forward in his chair, staring into the infinite, swirling tunnel of hyperspace. The galaxy was a dark, dangerous place. The void was full of teeth. But as the Goliath limped through the dark, bleeding, scarred and triumphant, Arthur knew one thing for certain. The dark was going to learn to be afraid of them. Did Captain Hayes prove why humanity is the most terrifying species in the galaxy? If you felt the chill of the void and the heat of that plasma burst, smash that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves gritty, realistic HFY sci-fi, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. We want to hear from you. What was the most badass moment in the Goliath survival? Let us know in the comments below. Stay strong, humans, and we'll see you in the next one.